Hello and welcome to my channel. We're going to be talking about the airline industry today, which is going to be just different for this channel. And this video is going to start out with a bit of a disclaimer is that I normally don't talk about the airline industry on this channel, and it isn't going to be a constant feature. So this is going to be more or less a one-off video for those that may get attracted just because of the topic at hand. Normally, I talk about the history of passenger trains in the United States before Amtrak, and on occasion Amtrak when it suits it, or I just have something to say. And this video is just going to be about the parallels between the airline industry, what they're facing today in what is increasingly becoming a post-COVID world, and what the railroads faced during both the Depression and kind of the mid to late 1950s, which is more or less when these parallels will make most sense. And also the images I will be using ahead they're not exactly to scale, quote unquote. They're representative, but there will be hopefully if I remember to link this, where I get the basic idea of the graph from is going to be in the description, hopefully, if I remember it, which with me, who knows. We're a professional operation. But anyways, we'll be just getting into this. So this is going to be something I synthesized as I was researching and writing for other videos, and from just the YouTube videos I occasionally see on the airline industry, and it's about how the product lifecycle reflects this, and just my blumbering and with industries like the railroad and airlines. And yeah, I know they're not products, but industries kind of go through their own life cycle as well, in some sense of the word. So the standard product life cycle is divided into 4 stages of development, and is usually talked about in marketing classes and is applied to products a company is developing and marketing. These 4 stages are the introductory phase, the growth phase, the maturity phase, and the decline phase. In the intro phase, products are available on the market, but few people are buying them. Early adopters and other people are using the product, and this could be something physical or a service. I'm just kind of using product loosely here, just as a for instance. Growth is slow and hard to come by, and the growth phase is when the mass market starts adopting the product becomes more widespread, alternatives start to develop, which leads to there being a lot of companies getting in and out of the market, and the product or offering changing, and companies making something similar or something different. Kind of think smartphones, which is also a very good parallel to this. At one point, it was basically just the BlackBerry was the only version of smartphones, and you had the iPhone, and then you immediately had Samsung and LG and a boatload of companies immediately exploding outward. I wouldn't really say in that market we've really hit the stable phase, which is the next one, which is the maturity phase. This is a phase when the product or market or industry stabilize around a set number of companies that effectively dominate the market, and the market, meaning sales, tends to be stable at this point or growing very slowly, meaning that growth mostly is coming at the expense of competitors rather than attracting growth into the market. And whether the market, again, stops growing in absolute terms or grows more predictably kind of depends on the market. Then the next and final phase in the academic telling of this is the decline phase, which is when demand goes down and businesses go under, merge, and otherwise the market just shifts and goes into a phase of shrinkage. So where does the railroad industry fit into this? So the railroad industry got going in the mid-1800s in the United States, and this started slowly. Railroads in some instances were built to complement canals or just haul heavy things from mines like coal. As time went on, they were far more important parts of the national economy, and into the run-up to the Civil War, the federal government wanted to start building railroads across the continent. But railroads were still fairly disorganized and small at this point, relative to what they are now at least. The best way to illustrate this is that railroads hadn't even set on a standard gauge yet, which is the distance between the inside of the rails. There were contenders like 4'9" Pennsy gauge, 4'8.5", which is the modern standard gauge, and 5' Southern gauge. And long story, incredibly short, Congress chartered the first 2 transcontinental railways in the 4'8.5" gauge, and the South lost the Civil War, and that was basically where that went. Growth was slow at this period, but after the Civil War, railroad construction exploded. Between 1869 and 1893 is when the railroad industry grew the most. By 1893, at least 5 more transcontinental lines would have been completed by various railroads and their tycoons that owned them. And this is when they laid the most track, grew the most revenue-wise and in market share terms, and became business empires and more or less settled into the mold that would exist until the 1960s. This isn't the period of the most technological progress and product development on the front of passenger service. Just as a slight aside, most of that would come after 1893. Not much else could be said about this time period without going into dramatically too much detail. Other than many companies formed, some never built anything but were absorbed into much larger companies. And that would expand or fulfill the reason why those companies are started. And I put 1893 as the end of this time period, since the Panic of 1893 basically ended most construction projects that hadn't started yet. Not to mention only 2 major railroad corridors were built after this period, those being the Choctaw route between Tucumcari, New Mexico and Memphis, Tennessee, which was later absorbed into the Rock Island Railroad in 1901, and the Milwaukee Roads Pacific extension between South Dakota and Washington State in 1906. And railroad mileage basically peaked around World War I, so there was some growth going into the maturity phase, but most of the major growth was done by 1893. The maturity phase of the industry was more or less between 1893 and either 1946 or 1957. I kind of give this 10-year period because some railroads peaked during World War II and went into decline almost immediately after the war ended, and some didn't face steep declines until the middle of the 1950s when the Boeing 707 was launched and the interstate highways started to be more completed and in a much more usable state. During the maturity phase is when railroads developed streamlined trains once the technology to make them viable was available in the 1930s, which is basically the form of passenger train that we think of today, excluding high-speed trains, of course. And this peak was interrupted by the Depression, which pushed ridership down and on passenger trains and then force them to adapt to maintain their riders. And this is going to be the first overlap we'll compare the two industries with. And hopefully the image I'm putting in, it's kind of also kind of revenue, kind of also passenger miles traveled in a year. So just keep that in mind, that this, again, the images are not perfectly scaled, but the size of the industry and how much it was used kind of did the same shape if you were to plot it, but again, not to scale. It's more representative. It's more of a, I don't know, it's representative. I'm not going to try to make any more of that than I need to. And as I said, the decline phase came at the earliest right after World War II for some regional railroads, just as the Chicago Great Western, because they weren't part of a major transcontinental system. This railroad had been struggling before the Depression, as an example, and other railroads basically saw their business, at least on the passenger side. From this point onwards, I will be talking mostly about the passenger trains and passenger airlines, kind of stabilized back to their Depression-era levels. And the decline for the railways very in earnestly started in 1957, and that was the year the Boeing 707 was launched, which is when basically the jet age got going. And this technological leap made flying a form of transportation that was more attractive and cheaper than it had been previously. And this is the second point of overlap that I'll talk about as I get past the basic overview of the airline industry. At this point, railroads were losing passengers and, unlike during the Depression, largely refused to adapt to the changes in the market. This slide continued until 1966 when railroads lost the mail contracts with the post office, which led to about a third of the remaining passenger trains being cut. And in 1971, the federal government decided that it would give the railroads an out instead of bailing them out or any other sort of thing or nationalization, and they created Amtrak. Amtrak relieved the railroads of their legal obligations as common carriers to carry intercity passengers in exchange for them giving over money, equipment, services to the National Railroad Passenger Corporation. If they opted in on April 30th, 1971, that would be the last day that they were obligated to run passenger trains. And of the 25 railroads that were running passenger trains in the United States and the 24 that were eligible, 20 of them elected to join Amtrak. Other aside is that some of these railways still did operate commuter trains well into the 80s. So there's at least another 15 years, aside from the 4 railways that didn't join Amtrak initially, that still did offer passenger service, sort of, kind of. It was commuter service, but they still ran it. well into the 80s. And also, as a aside, the peak of railway travel in the U.S. was in 1929 when there were 10,000 trains running daily, and in 1971 there were about 1,000. And if I remember the math correctly from the last video I made on a subject similar to this, Amtrak ended up being responsible for about half of them and cut service by 40% when they took over. So again, a lot of cuts. So it was basically like a 90% drop before Amtrak took over. So this is the point where railroads from the passenger and freight parts were just separated from each other. Not much would change for the railroads until the Staggers Act of 1980, and largely this deregulated the railroads, which was part of deregulation kind of as a time period in the history of the United States and the government. Around the same time, the last vestiges of private passenger service also disappeared from the U.S. until the launch of Brightline. The railroads pieced themselves together, and the 1990s and 2000s ended up being kind of a rebirth phase for them. Since the mega merger era of the 90s, railroads have seen a resurgence. They're carrying more freight than they have in a long time. Passenger service is growing again. At least Amtrak and commuter railways were before the pandemic hit, and basically every year before that was a record year for Amtrak, as well as many different parts of the country are setting their own regional rail systems. And the airline industry, from a passenger perspective, also had a similar cycle. Ridership in passenger miles was relatively flat from the 1920s till World War II, and growth was small, and air travel was mainly a rich man's way to travel. At the same time, trains were at least accessible to the lower middle class. A round-trip tourist fare from Chicago to San Francisco in the late 1930s would cost the equivalent of $1,600 today, and the equivalent flight would be around $4,000. In inflation-adjusted terms. And a tourist fare on a railroad would include a lower berth, at least the $1,600 fare that I'm citing, which is basically just a bunk bed. More enclosed than that, and again, I have a whole video on what that was like before Amtrak, but basically you have two bench seats facing each other and it folds into a bed. And food at this point was a la carte and would cost the equivalent of $50 per day. Ridership on the airlines started growing slowly but steadily after World War II. The war minted a bunch of new pilots and planes and infrastructure that the airlines needed to operate. Despite getting land grants, the railroads didn't really get a comparable leap in capacity on the dime of the federal government at any point in their history. But the one thing they did share was a regulatory regime that stifled the industries and essentially prevented the airlines from growing as quickly as they could have, and did after deregulation. Yes, the technology hadn't caught up by the late 1940s, but it did in the 50s, and when jets were starting to fly, and then close that gap in the 60s with the launch of the 747. And as a side note, I'm aware that there weren't many 707s flying in the 50s. This was just a watershed moment, as it were. This would have led to growth, but the regulations at the time throttled growth in the airline and other industries in the U.S., specifically with transportation and shipping. Deregulation started with the creation of Conrail and culminated with the Staggers Act, which was the last. And airline deregulation was started in 1978. And following 1978, passenger miles basically went up in a straight line. And this explosive growth basically continued until 2008, with only a brief dip in 2001. After the 9/11 attacks. Also, this is the point where I will say that this is a US-only video. Like, this has no bearing on any international markets relative to the US. So if you're saying this was different in Europe or England or wherever, again, US only. This is a US-only analysis. I would also consider the time between deregulation and 2008 the high-growth period of airlines, because many airlines launched and went bankrupt during this time, as well as just the market expanded as much as it did, and the airlines began experimenting with new products, new business models, and a laundry list of new airlines started to get going, attempted to rise, and went under. And a bunch of the existing legacy carriers either went under themselves or merged with each other. I wouldn't classify the jet age between 1957 and 1978 the golden age that it largely gets called, because it was a period of forced luxury and stifled growth that even the government admitted wasn't sustainable in the 1970s. And another reason is that airlines experimented with more offerings in the 90s and 2000s, and more than they could and didn't during the quote-unquote golden age. So again, the idea that the 60s was the golden age of flying, it really wasn't. You can still pay for that experience in business class if you want, but the idea that business class even existed was something that didn't come until after deregulation, more or less. Following the 2008 recession is when I would say airlines in the US hit their maturity. The market had largely stabilized around four main carriers and a list of small ones. And on top of that, new companies aren't really chomping at the bit to get in the industry. So far, I think like two have started since 2008. And on top of this, airlines were starting to up the quality of business class by offering lie flat seats, higher quality meals with wine, and offering the in-between between coach and passenger, so premium economy. The background in the conditions in the industry where the passenger miles traveled were largely leveling off and starting to grow at a much slower, more predictable rate, and airlines had largely entered into a frankly profitable period, and probably their only really profitable period since deregulation. And honestly, probably the only, again, profitable period that they will probably, at least till after COVID at least, that they may ever seen. Warren Buffett even noted that when he wrote down his airline investments in the mid-2000s that no one had ever made money carrying passengers. So again, the period between 08 and beginning of 2020 probably going to be remembered as their golden age if they don't really recover, based on the potential issues that I see coming and they've already been noticed and other people have commented on, which is that presently we're dealing with the aftermath of COVID and the COVID collapse. And the two main parallels I see between the private passenger rail operations before the 1960s and how airlines are going to have to deal with now and what they can do to adapt, or might do. The first parallel was that the drop in traffic was brought on by unforeseen circumstances. The railroad suffered through this in the 30s during the Great Depression. The response from these railroads was the launch of new technology in the form of streamlined trains. And the streamliners don't look like a huge jump in technology from the face of it, but they were. They were much lighter than their heavyweight counterparts, which meant they were cheaper to haul, which meant the margins would be better on them. And this was also a time period when diesel engines were first being used in any significant number, and their performance during the war is what cemented them into post-war fleets, which is also why in the US we're generally use diesels now. That's why steam engines died off. Other things that streamliners had were better bathrooms and closed sleeping compartments, and another technology that was new for the time, which was air conditioning. And also, this was air conditioning that was actually steam powered. This wasn't like compressor-driven air conditioning that we'd be familiar with. The technology to safely do that on a train didn't exist until the 50s and wasn't really used in any scale on passenger trains until the 70s, which is when Amtrak modernized their fleet and started buying new cars. Other innovations during this time were the run of tourist trains that I mentioned earlier in the price comparison. These trains were made of modernized heavyweight equipment with cheaper fares than their streamlined and or first-class counterparts. The modernization of these older trains was mostly that they were given air conditioning, and a few other of what few compartments they had were replaced with sections. These trains were a response to a survey by the Union Pacific that showed that people wanted more frequent trains at lower prices. This is much how airlines continuously make quote-unquote economy worse to cram more seats in and offer lower fares. In the context of COVID and the airlines, many of them the airlines at least, are starting to restructure their routes away from business destinations to vacation destinations. I remember reading about how American Airlines basically changed much of their East Coast network capacity from Florida to away from business travel in the eastern U.S. And United even jumped in on this by launching service from the upper Midwest to Florida, which is more surprising because United is very much committed to the hub and spoke model, and some of this traffic flew between secondary airports instead of through a hub. So in a sense, the airlines are paralleling what the railroads faced during the Depression, and they're starting to launch services to attract vacation and family travel instead of mostly business travelers. And this is really the best case scenario for them, since this would mean a recovery for them in the long run, instead of what could happen in the second parallel. So the second option and possible parallel is that technology might cause a major shift in travel patterns long term. The push to virtual work and the use of platforms like Zoom and Teams could very much change this. The parallel to the railroads would be the launch of the Boeing 707. This made travel by plane more affordable, comfortable, and faster than taking trains, which is basically what killed off first-class rail passengers in the 1960s, and a little bit in the 50s too, but the highways also took a chunk out of that. First-class travelers being the people that were traveling on business or rich people traveling and generally paying for Pullman accommodations on trains and eating every meal in the dining car. Because remember, at this point, food was not included in your sleeper fare, and they also really pushed alcohol in the observation cars. And including food into your ticket price was actually a thing Amtrak started doing in the U.S. in the 80s. And now there is a very real concern that a lot of domestic business travel will be replaced by working together on platforms like Teams or conducting meetings over Zoom rather than flying someone in business class somewhere, paying for hotels and other things such as food and car rentals. So not only could this hurt the airline industry, but it would also eventually hurt associated industries such as hotels, restaurants, rental cars, and so on. And at the time when the railways kind of shifted, rental cars and hotels really quickly shifted to other forms of transportation as well because the market hadn't really shrunk, it just shifted. This could also be a humongous shift as well and possible slight shrinkage in the medium term. So this doesn't seem like a bad thing until you realize that business class travelers pay for most of the airline's operating costs on their own. Well, rather their companies pay for the airlines to more or less operate. If business travel does take a significant hit after the pandemic is over, then airlines will have a lot harder time staying financially solvent. Even though most passengers might be riding in coach, the people in business class and even premium economy are the ones effectively paying the bills. This potential transition is more akin to the launch of Boeing 707 and the 747 later on down the line because they are technological change that can change travel patterns. If business class doesn't recover, the airlines might see a slow and painful decline just like the railroads were facing in the 50s and 60s. As to what path the industry goes down, I have no idea, or what would be done to mitigate these issues with either happening. So again, we'll do the disclaimers. This was, again, U.S. domestic market only and not the world or any other airline market. And as mentioned at the top, this is going to be a one-off video more or less. Normally I talk about trains and their history and of generally passenger trains before Amtrak on this channel. So if you stick around, great. If not, and you're new and have never seen this channel before, thank you for listening and hope you have a good day. Just enjoy whatever. And for those of you who are my more stable and long-term viewers or people who are going to stick around, I will be doing a little bit of an ad right now, which is I'm going to be making a video talking about the Granger railroads, their successes, their failures, and analysis into why they failed, what they could have done differently, and how that affected the rail industry in the United States Midwest during the 60s and 70s and 80s. So that'll come out shooting for early October, but at least at time of recording this in the middle of May. The research is largely done. I just need to finish up the writing and maybe tie up a few loose ends, and then it will be ready to be recorded and eventually made. So I hope you do stick around for that and you do enjoy, and see you in the next one for those that are be hanging around.